Welcome to Galactic Audiobooks. I'm Max, and today I'll be your narrator. But before we dive into today's story, please take a moment to quickly check below and see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps ensure our videos appear more often in your feed. Let's get started. Frank Harris was no stranger to death. As a soldier, he had fought in battles where lives were lost in an instant, and as a mercenary, he had seen the brutality of war on both sides. He had killed men and women, rebels, and soldiers, even a child once, though that had been a mistake. Each death left a scar in his mind, but none compared to the girl from the war-torn city of Doran. Her golden eyes, wide with fear yet silent in the face of death, had haunted him ever since. She didn't scream, didn't plead, but just stared at him as the firestorm swallowed her whole. He had tried to save her. He always tried, but this time, the weight of failure was unbearable. He couldn't outrun the blast. He couldn't save her. Her death lingered in his thoughts like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every decision he made since. Years passed, and Frank found himself standing on the barren world of Vandra, a forgotten planet in the farthest reaches of the galaxy. This was a place where survival came at a cost, where the air was thick with toxins that burned the throat and choked the lungs. The ground below was scarred by the ruins of an ancient mining colony, long abandoned and now only a hollow shell of its former self. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, a stench of rust, rot, and abandoned dreams. Bioluminescent moss flickered along the jagged rocks, casting an eerie glow that painted the world in shades of sickly green and blue. The wind whispered through the empty canyons, like the ghosts of those who had come before, all lost to time and forgotten in this forsaken place. Vandera was a world forgotten by the galaxy at large, a haven for criminals, mercenaries, and those who sought to escape the prying eyes of law and morality. This was where men like Frank came to forget their pasts or to bury them deep enough that they could never haunt them again. But as he stood at the edge of the cavernous market known as Korma, Frank realized that his past was not something that could be so easily forgotten. It followed him everywhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting to remind him of his failures. Korma was an underground market, carved deep into the mountainside, where the worst of the galaxy's outcasts came to trade in forbidden goods. Here, people were bought and sold like cattle, and the stench of human suffering was palpable in every corner. The market was built into the skeletal remains of an old mining colony, long abandoned, and its halls echoed with the cries of those trapped in the underworld of galactic commerce. Frank wasn't here for goods. He wasn't here for weapons or illegal tech, though there was plenty of that. He wasn't here to buy the finest slave or the rarest artifact. He was here for one thing and one thing only: to find Threx, the man who had betrayed him during the war on Duran's Gate. But as Frank made his way through the crowded, damp market, something caught his eye, something that would change everything. On a pedestal in the far corner of the market, bathed in cold, flickering neon light, stood a girl. At first glance, she seemed almost unreal, too fragile, too perfect, like a statue crafted by an artist who had never seen a real human being. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale blue, her features sharp and delicate, like fine porcelain. Her long black hair flowed down her back in waves, like a dark river. But it was her eyes that caught Frank's attention, pale violet eyes that glowed faintly in a dim light. Those eyes, so empty and distant, so devoid of hope, drew him in. She wasn't staring at anything, at the crowd, at the market, at him. She was staring into nothingness, as if waiting for something that would never come. She didn't seem alive, not in any real sense. She was a thing, a possession, a commodity on display. The tag beside her read the lens stock, empathy class. Frank's heart sank as he read it. The Thales, an ancient, telepathic race, their powers so profound that they could feel the emotions of others, could even mirror them. Once, they had been revered for their peaceful ways, their ability to sense the feelings of others and heal the wounded. But now, that power had become a curse. The galaxy didn't want peace anymore. The galaxy wanted power, entertainment, and control. And so the Thales were hunted down, their powers twisted and manipulated by those with the wealth to exploit them. Now, the girl standing before Frank was nothing more than a tool, an object to be sold, a living mirror for the emotions of others, to be used and discarded when her value had run out. She was likely sold to the highest bidder, used by the rich and powerful to amplify their darkest desires, fear, pain, pleasure, her body reacting to their every whim, her mind trapped in a cycle of torment. Her mind, her emotions, were no longer her own. Frank had seen this before, the way they twisted people, using them until they were broken beyond repair. But as he watched the girl on the pedestal, he couldn't help but feel something stir inside him. Something that he hadn't felt in years, recognition. He didn't know why, but in that moment, he knew that he couldn't let her be sold to the highest bidder. She wasn't just another slave, another victim. She was someone who had been torn apart by the galaxy, just like him. Frank knew what he had to do. He had to buy her not as a slave, not as a tool, but as a person. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, he could save them both from the ghosts of their pasts. The air in the underground market buzzed with the clinking of metal, the hum of dark energy, and the faint cries of desperate souls. Frank's boots echoed on the cold stone as he moved toward the stall where the girl stood. The dealer, a greasy figure with a crooked smile, didn't take his eyes off the price tag beside her. He knew his merchandise well, knew how much her kind could fetch in the right hands. "She's a rare one," the dealer said with a sickening grin, gesturing toward the girl who stood motionless on the pedestal. "Conditioned for years. Some buyers want her for her looks, others for the resonance. She's a weapon and a treasure all in one." The girl didn't react. Her stillness seemed unnatural, as if she had learned that any movement, any attempt to show emotion, would only bring her pain. Frank's gaze fixed on her for a moment, the weight of his past pressing down harder. She was beautiful in a way that was haunting, too delicate, too perfect, and yet broken in ways Frank could not fathom. Her pale blue skin shimmered faintly under the harsh lights, her long black hair falling like liquid shadows. Without responding to the dealer's boastful words, Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a solid-state credit chip. He tossed it onto the counter, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The dealer's smirk faltered for a moment as he processed the sum. "You've got the money?" the dealer asked, his tone now tinged with surprise. "Enough," Frank said, his voice cold, carrying the weight of someone who had done this before. His hand rested lightly on the handle of a blade hidden beneath his coat, but his eyes never left the girl. The dealer hesitated, scanning the chip, then shrugged and moved toward the cage with a chuckle. "I thought you were just here for the bounty." Guess you're interested in more than just a quick payday. His voice dropped to a murmur. She's not cheap. The modifications alone. Frank interrupted him, his voice steely. I'm not here to talk. Open the cage. The dealer nodded, his face shifting into a wary frown. The cold, metallic clink of the neural collar disengaging echoed in the dim space as the collar around the girl's neck flickered off, releasing her from the cruel restraints that had held her for so long. Frank stepped forward, his movements slow, calculated. The girl didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge him, her violet eyes still distant, flickering with the faintest hint of recognition, though whether it was curiosity or a deeper, more instinctual response, he couldn't tell. I'm not here to hurt you, Frank said softly, almost as an apology. His words were not forceful, but they carried something else, something deeper. A promise? A reassurance? Her eyes briefly flickered in his direction, but she didn't move. She was a creature of silence, trained not to trust anyone, not even herself. Frank understood that. He couldn't offer her much, but he could offer her something simple, a chance to leave. Without a word, she followed him, the soft whisper of her steps the only sound as they moved through the marketplace's dark, echoing corridors. The weight of the past followed them, lingering like a shadow. Frank didn't need to ask her name, he didn't need to know who she was or what had happened to her. The journey ahead would reveal everything in time, if she was willing to let it. The shuttle was cramped, a relic of a bygone era, with scratched metal walls and broken control panels. But for the first time in a long time, Frank didn't mind. He powered up the engines, the hum of the ship filling the silence between them. As they soared into the cold expanse of space, Frank set course for a nearby uncharted moon. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound in the cockpit. The girl sat still beside him, her violet eyes never leaving the viewport, watching the stars pass by. Frank didn't expect her to speak. She hadn't said a word since he bought her. The silence between them was thick, suffocating even. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the absence of sound, of words, of pain. Frank thought about her past, about the things she had endured. He didn't know her name, her history, but that didn't matter. He wasn't here to pry. He wasn't here to try and fix her or heal the wounds she carried. No, he was here because of his own failures, because he understood what it meant to feel like an echo of the past, like a man who had lost himself in the weight of his own mistakes. The days passed in that same heavy silence. The quiet between them was not oppressive, it was peaceful, if not a little haunting. Frank had fought in wars, survived betrayals, and fought for his life in ways that changed him. But the silence of this girl, her stillness, her absence of emotion, felt like a different kind of battlefield, one he didn't know how to navigate. She never spoke. Never asked anything of him. Her eyes moved ever so slightly when he shifted in his seat or when he glanced her way. She never flinched, never looked at him with fear or anger, just the same distant stare. She had become a mirror of the pain that had shaped her, a reflection of everything she had suffered. He noticed the small things, the way her hands twitched when someone walked too close, the way her posture never shifted, always poised but defensive. She never slept fully, always awake in that unnerving stillness. Frank began to wonder if she even remembered what it felt like to trust, or to want something beyond survival. But one thing was clear: this girl, broken as she was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor. And whether she knew it or not, so was he. They weren't so different, after all. The ship's engines hummed steadily, and as they traveled deeper into the dark void of space, Frank couldn't help but feel that this quiet, this journey through the unknown, was not a path to an end, but to something else. Whether that something would be redemption, survival, or something else entirely, he didn't know yet. But he was certain of one thing: he would never walk away from this. Not from her. Not again. The moon was desolate, its surface scarred by ancient impacts and long-abandoned structures half swallowed by creeping vegetation. It wasn't the haven Frank had hoped for, but it had become something unexpected, a place where the past no longer chased him down. It was isolated, far from the reach of those who would use them, far from the cruelty of the galaxy's ever-turning wheel of exploitation. The air was thin here, just enough to sustain life, but not enough to support civilization. The sky above was a dull shade of brown, casting the land in a muted glow that made the world feel distant, untouched, and forgotten. But in this forgotten place, something had begun to shift, something deep and unspoken between Frank and the girl. Frank had long since stopped trying to understand her silence. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for anything. Yet, over the days, the weight of her presence, her stillness grew. She had followed him here, but it was clear she didn't trust him completely, and yet, neither did he trust her. The silence wasn't just from her, it was mutual. A silence built from brokenness, from too much loss, too much pain. And for that, it was comforting. But one night, as the cold of the moon's surface crept into their makeshift shelter, she finally spoke. Her voice was faint, almost fragile, like a bird's first call after the storm. "Why me?" The question hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't a question he had an answer to. Not one that would make sense to her. He had spent his life fighting wars, killing, surviving, but he had never fought for someone else. Never had he cared enough to act without some kind of gain, until now. Frank didn't have a clear answer, but he gave the truth, as raw as it was. "Because I couldn't walk away," he said quietly, his voice rough with years of unspoken regret. "You looked at me like you saw something more than just a soldier. And I couldn't ignore that." For the first time, she truly looked at him, really saw him. Her violet eyes, once vacant and distant, now flickered with something more than just curiosity. It was recognition, tentative but there. She didn't fear him. She didn't regard him with the cold detachment that had been her armor. For the first time, he felt her see him as more than just a man who had freed her from the cage. And in that moment, Frank knew. There was a chance for them. For both of them. Not just to survive, but to rebuild, to find something beyond the wreckage they had both been dragged through. Hope, like a small flicker in the darkness, began to stir between them. The days passed with a quiet rhythm. They worked together, fixing up the dilapidated estate on the moon. The place had once been a refuge for others, but now it was nothing more than a memory, crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. But as Frank and the girl labored, fixing the roof, clearing out debris, planting the first seeds of life in the once dead soil, something else grew in understanding between them. They didn't speak of it, the past that haunted them both. He didn't press her for details, and she didn't ask about his history. The silence was no longer a barrier. It was something they had both come to respect, a quiet understanding that there was nothing left to prove to each other. They were two broken souls, trying to put the pieces back together, one task at a time. Frank began to see her as more than just the product of a broken system, more than just a tool that had been misused by the galaxy. She was strong in ways he hadn't expected. In the silence, in her presence, he realized she had learned to survive without hope, without trust, but she had survived all the same. He didn't know how, but in her eyes, in the quiet moments they shared, he saw something in her. A spark, a flicker of the person she had once been. Maybe that was enough. But as the days bled into weeks, they couldn't hide forever. The ghosts of their pasts had always been just beyond the horizon, waiting. And when the ship arrived, Frank knew the time had come to face them. The sleek vessel broke through the atmosphere with the ease of a predator, low and fast, its silhouette cutting through the orange sky like a knife. Frank didn't need to see the markings. He knew who it was. It was them. The men who had used her. The ones who had owned her. The ones who had thought they could control her, break her, use her for their twisted desires. The door to their shelter opened, and Frank didn't even need to say anything. The girl no, Sarai had already moved to stand beside him. There was no fear in her eyes. Only a steady resolve. "They're here," Frank said, his voice tight. He could feel the weight of the old scars on his chest, the ones he had never truly faced. He had been running from them for so long, and now they had caught up to him. But Sarai wasn't the same as she had been. No longer a prisoner, no longer just an empathy chained to the whims of others. She was more than that now. She was a survivor, and she wasn't going to let them take her back. Not now. Not ever. "They won't take me again," she said softly, her voice unwavering. Frank turned to her, searching her face, and for the first time, he saw hope. A strength that she had carried deep inside her all along, hidden beneath layers of pain. They moved together, side by side, facing the enemy that had once controlled her life, but never her soul. And when the battle came, it wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom. A fight to reclaim their lives. A fight not just against the men who had once used them, but against the ghosts that had followed them for so long. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even them. Frank's hands, once accustomed only to the brutality of war, moved with a precision born from something deeper, something more than instinct. And Sarai, no longer a pawn, fought beside him with a strength that was all her own. They were a team now. Not just two survivors, but two warriors. Two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The fight was brutal, but it was theirs to win. Together, they faced the ghosts of their past, and in doing so, they set themselves free. As the last of the enemies fell, the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was a silence that marked the end of a chapter and the beginning of something new. They stood side by side, looking out at the wreckage of the battle, but there was no regret in their eyes. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had fought not just for themselves, but for each other. They had faced their past, together, and come out the other side stronger. Now, as they stood together in the aftermath, Frank realized that he had found something he never thought possible: redemption, not just for himself, but for them both. And as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, the future lay ahead of them, wide open, full of possibilities.